Philip Berrigan was a legendary American peacemaker. He was a Catholic priest born in 1923. He went to World War II willingly, knowingly, and in his autobiography called Fighting the Lamb's War, said that he wanted to kill as many Nazis as he could because he had fallen under sort of that propaganda and that idea that this was the best way to go about resolving international conflicts. And so he goes to World War II. He's in Europe. He sees a lot of action and he sees a lot of things and does a lot of things that has a very dramatic effect on his psyche, on his faith. And so when he returns home, he goes through this long period of discernment and eventually decides to follow in the footsteps of his older brother, Daniel, and he becomes a priest. And he chooses the Josephite order of the Catholic priests because when he was in the service and was stationed down south, he saw the horrendous racism that was going on down there. And he was deeply offended by this. And the Josephites are a Catholic order dedicated to serving African Americans. So that's where he wanted to be. So in the early 1950s, he joins that order and he is ordained as a priest and he is sent down south to work. And he immediately starts getting involved in civil rights activities and trying to end segregation and trying to organize the African American community so that they have tenant rights against landlords and all kinds of things that aggravate the church to no end and aggravate his parish to no end. But again, Phil, you'll see this time and again if you read through the book that Phil is his own man. He's a very forceful, very powerful personality, and he has a very strong sense of right and wrong. And so as his church tries to move him around to silence him, he continues to speak out and organize wherever he goes. And as the 50s turn into the 1960s and the Vietnam War starts to get hot in the sense of American involvement, he recognizes this inextricable link between racism and war making. And he starts to write about this. And his first book comes out in 1965 called No More Strangers, and it's about race segregation in America. And he understands that once we impose tyranny on one segment of our society here at home, the African community, it becomes much easier for us to impose tyranny on people in other lands. And vice versa. Once we impose tyranny on people in other lands, it's easier for us to do that here. So he sees that as a link between militarism and racism. And what he also sees as a fundamental link between the two is that the enormous amount of money that is spent on a militaristic culture is taking away from the needs of the African American community. When he was down in New Orleans during the Cuban Missile Crisis, one thing he noticed was that all of the middle class and upper middle class whites were able to flee the area, but the African American community was left behind. And this really struck him as a very sort of sobering connection between racism and militarism. So his activities start to branch out from civil rights activism to anti-war activism. And this is where he really becomes known in a public eye. He starts attending anti-war rallies. He's speaking out against America's involvement in Vietnam. And of course, eventually he organizes this action called the Baltimore Four in 1967, where he and three colleagues go into a selective service office and they pour their blood on draft files. And when I read about that, and I've read about it from so many perspectives, I'm always struck by the creativity of that action, because that action didn't come to Phil and his colleagues as a fully formed idea. That was a process through which they were talking about how do we register our opposition to the war? And what's the perfect symbol to use to register this opposition? And as they had this discernment, they landed on, these draft files that are conscripting young American men to go to Vietnam and kill or be killed. These are malevolent, awful pieces of paper. They don't have a right to exist. And Phil called them human hunting licenses. And so they landed on the perfect symbol. And then the question became, what do we do with the symbol? How do we register our opposition to that symbol? And the idea was if you pour blood on it, it's symbolic not only of the spilt blood of Christ, but of the spilt blood of Americans and Vietnamese in this war. And so that's just an example of how nonviolent resistance has to constantly be recreated for the present moment and the present time. Gandhi did it with his Salt March. Martin Luther King did it with the Montgomery bus boycott, and Phil and his colleagues do it with the blood on the draft files. And they don't stop there. They're quickly arrested for that. The idea is, of course, to be arrested for it. That's part of the witness that they do. But while he's out pending trial for that event, in early 1968, he organizes an even bigger action where they raid another selective service office in Catonsville, Maryland. And this time they take hundreds of files out into the parking lot and they pour homemade napalm on the files. Again, another very potent symbol of the war in Vietnam, the draft files and the homemade napalm. And that gathers just international interest. There's a big trial. The press is there each day. And Phil receives, just for the Baltimore action, Phil receives a sentence of 6 years. And on top of that, the Catonsville action is a sentence of 3 years. And Dan, his brother, joins in the Catonsville action. And of course, they then continue their anti-war activities in a variety of ways by going underground, refusing to report for prison, becoming fugitives from justice. And it continues all the way up till they're eventually apprehended. When Phil was released in 1973 and the war in Vietnam is winding down, the question for him becomes, how do I continue nonviolent resistance in a community, in a family? Because at this time, he's left the church, he's married Elizabeth McAllister, and they're starting a family. And so they start Jonah House in Baltimore, a Catholic worker type house, an intentional community of faith, resistance, family, of feeding the neighborhood, but then doing resistance action and going to jail when necessary. And so his nonviolent resistance continues throughout the 70s. He starts the Plowshares movement in 1980 with his colleagues when they go into the General Electric facility. And he does this all the way up until his death in 2002. And time and again, he's arrested for it. And he spends a total of 11 years in prison for nonviolent resistance to war. Now, that's hard time. That's a long stretch. And he was only released from prison just a few months before his death from cancer in 2002. But I think that gives you an insight into his character. He was driven by his faith throughout, and he was continually writing throughout. He was publishing numerous books, giving speeches, constantly organizing, constantly mobilizing. And so my thought was, this man's life is a great example of nonviolent resistance, and his writings are so powerful. We need to get them back in front of the public again, especially to young generations who may not have ever heard of Philip Berrigan. And so since his writings, as I said, were out of print, I thought, let's get all of this back together. I went to Cornell University, where the Berrigan papers are housed, and then DePaul University in Chicago, where the other half of the Berrigan papers are housed. And I began the research, and it was about 3.5 years of going through the papers and editing them and figuring out the best way to compile them to make a really compelling story, because I wanted Phil to speak for himself in this book, because I think he's such a good writer. And so I arranged them chronologically. So it tells the story of Phil's life, and you can see the evolution of his faith, of his witness, of his work. And interestingly, you can also see the devolution, the devolving of the United States government in that same time period, that same post-World War time period, as it devolves into war and violence and repression at home. And so you have these intersecting paths of Phil going up, becoming fully human, as he's trying to do, and the United States devolving into war and repression. So I think the book and Phil speaks for himself in these writings. And you'll see the earliest writing I put in there is from 1958, and the last writing is from his deathbed in 2002. And it covers a great piece of American history, but more importantly, it provides us a wonderful example of an individual who was dedicated to nonviolent resistance and who truly saw everybody across the globe as being connected in brother and sisterhood. And he was willing to put his life and his liberty on the line for that, lose his liberation, go to prison, be persecuted, have the church turn against him, his family, and others. But again, I think a wonderful example of witness work and writing that is there for all of us to look at and benefit from and share and talk about. So I hope that's a good background to get us started on what I hope is a good conversation tonight.
Brad, it's terrific. Really, I knew some of the biology, I mean the biography, but your recap and your lessons derived are so beautiful. So thank you for that beginning. I had some questions to get us going. Talk a little bit more about your process, because I understand that while you were researching it, you literally took pictures of the text
I
in the
did.
library archives, and then could you talk a little bit more about what
Sure.
you did there?
This is the first time I ever took on a project like this. I've never published a book before. So I was a rookie, and I had a friend, Father John Deere, who's a good friend of mine, and he put me in touch with Philip Berrigan and Elizabeth McAllister. And I talked to them and I told them about this idea of the book, and God bless them. They said, sure, go ahead. So they gave me the approval to do it and got into the archives. And when I got first, I got into the archives in Cornell. There's hundreds of boxes of Berrigan papers. And they have this very slow process there where you mimeograph things with the software that you have to download to your laptop. And it would have taken me forever. So the only thing I thought to do was to use my iPhone and just photograph every page of every document that I thought I wanted to use that was representative of Phil's best writings. And so some of those documents would be 15 or 20 pages long because it'd be a typed speech from Phil. Other documents may be something he wrote on the back of a church hymnal or a church bulletin, because he was just scribbling on every piece of paper he could find. And his prison journals were in there, and I'd photograph them, and I'd photograph excerpts from books and everything I thought that I wanted to use, court testimony from when he was on the stand. And I came home from Cornell and DePaul with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures. And then I had to get it onto my computer to start the editing process. So the only way I knew to do that was to hold my iPhone and dictate out loud into my laptop from my iPhone. And so what I was doing, and I didn't realize the benefit of this, but what I was doing was saying Phil's words out loud. And in a way, when you do that, you take a certain ownership of the words and you certain investment in the words. And there were so many times when I'd be reading something Phil had written and I would stop and just say, wow, that is really powerful. Am I up to that task? Am I able to convincingly say that for myself the way Phil said it? So that was a benefit that I hadn't anticipated in terms of reading Phil's words out loud. So if any of you buy the book or have the book, try reading a couple of the passages out loud and see if it doesn't have a different effect on you, and see if you don't have a certain ownership and a certain wow factor in saying those words out loud, because Phil is defiant, he is direct, he's prophetic, and he's profound in what he says.
So do you have a particular passage to read to us, not too long, that
Sure. When
you were reading it out loud to yourself, you just were mesmerized, or your heart was exploding?
I have a couple actually, and I'll start with one, which is where I got the title, A Ministry of Risk. And that was my first day in the Cornell archives. About an hour or two into the process, I pulled out a typed speech of Phil's from 1973 that had never been published before. And he was doing an ordination of another Catholic priest. And the title on the first page said, A Ministry of Risk and Liberation. And I thought, that's it. A Ministry of Risk is a perfect title for the book. It captures Phil's life, but it also kind of includes us, because we can all undertake a ministry of risk. We don't have to be priests or pastors. We're all able to be with Phil in this together and undertake some kind of risk for peacemaking. And the quote where A Ministry of Risk came from was what really blew me away. So I'll just read this one paragraph. And he says, a ministry of risk goes unerringly to the side of the victims, to those threatened or destroyed by greed, prejudice, and war. From the side of those victims, it teaches two simple, indispensable lessons. Number one, that we all belong in the ditch or in the breach with the victims. And number two, that until we go to the ditch or into the breach, victimizing will not cease. So saying that out loud, again, was pretty powerful. And that's a paragraph I turn to again and again. And I always tell myself, until we go into the breach with the victims, victimizing will not cease. So that was a good paragraph. I'll read one more if I can real quick, Claire, because this is 1971. Phil has been hammered with indictments from the United States government at this time. He's been subjected to all kinds of political show trials, and he's a veteran of the war. He's not intimidated easily, even by a threat of life imprisonment. But this is how he responds to the Harrisburg indictment, where they were threatening to put him away for life. He writes, I will not respond to this indictment as the government will have me. It is a potpourri of false charges, absurd allegations, and acts labeled crimes by the law. As a legal document, this indictment is about as sane or insane as our government's Indochina war. In fact, one is the stepchild of the other, legal overkill following military overkill. Both are devious, ruthless, and mad. I will regard it, therefore, as a piece of legal pathology supporting our military pathology in Southeast Asia, and I will resist it as I resist the war. And that's very typical of how he would write and respond to the government's arrests and trials. And when I was at DePaul at one point, I just took all of these arrest warrants and court summons that Phil had gotten during a short period of time in the early 1990s. And I just laid them out on the table, all these envelopes from different courts and things like that, to take a picture of them, because there were so many. It filled this one table just for a short period of time. And then I noticed that some of the court summons hadn't even been opened. He didn't even bother to open it, which was just another way of Phil registering his nonviolent resistance to empire, to the government, and to what they were trying to do to him.
Yeah, that last segment was very much the voice of Phil, that when I think about it in my head, I can quickly imagine. You had such a terrific observation in the beginning about Phil's exposure to racism and the treatment of Blacks motivating his opposition to war. I think you said that once we impose tyranny on one people at home, we can do it abroad. And the pendulum swings the other way. If we do it abroad, we can do it at home. And that link is so critical and relevant today, I think, as we're looking at the conflict in the Middle East. But if you could talk a bit about his writing, when you and I were speaking, you said you had to excise his writing on race, and that was a tough call for you because he had written a lot on race. But if you can talk a little bit about that connection that he saw very
Sure.
clearly between racism and militarism.
Yeah, the Cornell files in particular were filled with Phil's writings on race. And after probably the second day or third day there, I had to make a decision as to what the book was going to be. Was it going to include Phil's writings on race, or was it just going to be about Phil's writings on peace and war? And there was too much to do both. So I decided to just make the book about his writings on nonviolent resistance, on peace and war, and include a few of his observations about race and where they're linked to militarism. But there was enough writing by Phil to easily fill another book, to edit another book just on his observations about race in America. And this is something that this connection between race, militarism, and materialism, the three evils that Dr. King talked about in 1967. Phil and Dan learned about that from Dorothy Day in the late 1950s and early 60s. She had seen that connection too, and she would talk to them about it. And then Phil would see that firsthand when he was working down in New Orleans at a parish down there. And as I said, he was appalled at that. And when he was in the service in World War II and was fighting in Europe, he saw that racism continue. And, this struck him very profoundly too. So when he comes back, this is something he's very dedicated to. And when he's in prison, I found his prison journals to be very interesting as he's writing about race, because these were journals that he likely never meant to be published. And typically when we write in a journal, it's about how we feel and what we did and what concerns us. But what I noticed in Phil's journals is that they were observations about other people. And he was making observations about African Americans in prison that were very astute, um, just demonstrating that had they been born in a different neighborhood, into a different family, they would have been the lawyers and CEOs and accountants and doctors of any community. But because of where they were born and the conditions in which they were born, they end up in prison with him. So he sees a brotherhood there with them, and sort of a common cause in what's going on. And I think that's why he was so emphatic about making his first book about race, No More Strangers. And I don't know if any of you've read that, but Thomas Merton writes the introduction, which is really quite interesting. And
Hmm.
it's why he continues to keep that cause going throughout the rest of his life.
Mhm. Yeah, we have a piece, actually it's on my laptop. We've yet to run it in the Radical, but it was an essay on race that he wrote for the New York Catholic Worker in the early 60s. It's amazing. It's
Yeah.
just amazing how astute it is. I wanted to ask about materialism. He characterized the American people as being brutalized by affluence. That's such a uh, particular phrase, and I wonder if you could talk about that, why the the problem with affluence.
Yeah, he said that we're brutalized by affluence, and he meant that on a number of levels. It's intentional, it's by design. It's, in one sense, brutalized by affluence means keeping the American citizen in a constant state of economic anxiety so that they cannot focus on what the government is doing in the larger issues of war and peace and how they're spending the national wealth. If most Americans are so concerned about their job, so concerned about their economic status, then and so concerned about being affluent and trying to get the next newest thing, then they're not going to have time to focus on these big issues of war and peace and offer any resistance to the government at all. The other more important piece of that phrase, brutalized by affluence, is what it does to the human psyche. When you do, if you are fortunate enough to have money and to keep yourself diverted with a lot of the latest toys and trips and whatever it may be, whatever catches your fancy, what does that do to the human personality, the human soul? And Phil's belief was that it makes us desensitized to the other problems in the world. So if we're filling our days up with, I don't know, golfing and traveling and things like that, we are tuning out the difficult issues of the war and America's responsibility for those issues. And that's easy to do because sometimes those problems are so big and so painful that you just feel like you can't deal with them. And so you tune them out. And if you're affluent, you're able to do that a little easier. But the problem Phil wrote about was what it does is it prevents us becoming fully human. And Phil wrote again and again about that the goal in this life is for us to become fully human. And to become fully human means that we don't tune those things out. That what we do is we let all of that information in, all of that bad news in, all of the pain and all of the tragedy, but also all of the opportunities for redemption and grace and beauty that come with it. And when you do that and you bring all that inside and you hold that within yourself, you have the opportunity to become fully human. And that is the goal of life. That's the journey that Phil tried to undertake throughout his life. And it's what he felt affluence works against. And that's how it brutalizes us. It desensitizes us and it makes us less human.
I'm curious, did he write about beauty?
He did. He would use the word beauty and for all his toughness and he was an athlete and a big guy and a soldier and very strong personality. He was capable of great tenderness in his writings and from I never met Phil or Dan, so I only know about Phil through his writings and through talking to as many people as I could who met him. And a lot of the personal anecdotes people told me about Phil was how accessible and how approachable he could be. He was funny. He had this self-deprecating sense of humor. But I'll read you something quick about that shows Phil's sense of tenderness and beauty. And this is something he wrote about Liz, his wife. And I found this and I didn't know if the kids had seen this because I found this in the archives. And so I sent it to Frida and I said, here's a piece of writing that Phil wrote about your mom that I think is really beautiful. And I just want to share it with you because I don't know if you've seen it before, but it's called A Tribute to Liz. And I'll just read the last paragraph. He says, I've never seen a person with less insulation between gospel and life. It almost seems that in her case, belief in the word attacks insulation, overwhelms it, throws it into retreat. That preserves her clarity, saves her from psychologizing, frees her for humor, movement, and life. So she works like a slave, but effortlessly, in cheerfulness and balance. She stays alive. She has no time for anything smacking of death, complaining, indulgence, self-pity, negativity, or irritability. There is service to offer, resistance to be planned, peace to make, life to live. And so I revere her, love her, remain in no little awe of her. She is a Christian, one of the holiest and wholest of the handful I know. Now, that's a really beautiful, touching, tender side of Phil that probably some people don't expect. And I tried to include a number of things that he wrote like that about Liz and about others that give you the other side of Philip Berrigan.
I have one more question and then we'll open it up because I'm being a greedy here. But there's because many of us sitting in this circle are from the Catholic tradition. This quote here from Phil in 65, the church, quote, has been particularly impotent in the face of war, quote, whether the conventional type or the present nuclear impasse, because it's always been against war in general, but never in particular. So could you talk about that? I think that's a really concise, precise observation against war in general, but never in the particular.
It is. That's a classic Phil Berrigan insight, and he was so good at seeing, getting to the heart of the matter, the essence of an issue. And I was in church today, the 12 o'clock mass, and from the pulpit, they ask for peace in the world, but that kind of generality really doesn't do much for what's happening and America's role in that. And so that's what Phil was getting at, is if you just talk about war in general, but don't name the specific genocide or the specific war that is occurring at the time, the way he was trying to do, and Dan and others were trying to do, then you really are just giving it a pass. And so one of the things he wrote, one of the passages is called, "We constitute the church in chains," and chains as in chains when you're in prison. And he wrote that when he was in prison because a bishop had come to see him. Bishop Baum had come to see him. The only Catholic bishop that came to see Phil Berrigan during the entire 11 years he was in prison. And he wrote him a letter, and just to say, why aren't there more bishops in jail? Why aren't there more priests in jail? Why aren't there more in the Catholic Church speaking out specifically against war rather than this general prayer for peace, which really is meaningless when you're not naming the particular crime that's being perpetrated at the time. And so I wrote down in this one piece of paper some of the phrases Phil used to talk about his criticisms of the church. Um, he says Christianity today places its emphasis upon worship at the expense of the works of mercy. Christians seek in religion a divine sanction for personal pride, a philosophy that will pad and cushion them from the demands of life or allow them to deal with only its most palatable forms. And then here are phrases of his some of his sentences that I kind of strung together that I thought worked because they just all expressed how he was learning this journey and going about it and the observations. He said, throughout his time, he would always ask, what does Christ ask of me? And in his journals, he would say things like, I'm haunted by the sinless one, and I'm trying to figure out what it's going to be with me. What am I going to do with my life? And how am I going to answer this question from Christ? And the way he answered the question was to say, you stand in the breach with the victims, you resist the culture of death, you grasp that Christianity and revolution are synonymous. That's not something you hear in the Catholic Church a lot. You understand that the true nature of Christian witness means being faithful enough to suffer and daring enough to serve. It means to accept that through our actions, we will constitute the church in chains. And it means to embrace a ministry of risk. So I thought those were all wonderful little phrases taken from a bunch of different writings of his that worked well together.
Mm. Constitute a church in chains.
Yeah.
Let's open it up. I'm sure people have questions, reflections. Maybe you can raise your hand physically, make sure your screen is turned on so I can see you, or use the icon. But boy, Brad, this is wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's always a thrill to talk about this.
Yeah. So do people have questions or Jeff, you're muted. You wanna, Jeff, did you
Yeah,
want to say? Okay, go
I'm
ahead, Jeff.
just fascinated by the connection you made because it just seems so relevant today that we have this great class divide in this country where so many people are just chasing their tail, working two jobs, and you know that they can't possibly have the time to find out, to see what our country is really up to, particularly overseas. And then you have a wealthy class that is just fine with, I shouldn't say a wealthy class, I should say some people who are profiting off of, the military industrial complex, who think everything is just fine. And we've got, Citizens United where they can buy all the government they want. And I'm not sure what my question is, but it's like, how do we change that? What's the first step? And
Well, I mean, and what you said, that is by design. That's not by accident.
right, it's by design.
It is by design. And, it's part of the capitalist design. And when you mix capitalism, democracy, and militarism, you've got a really potent brew there for trouble. Because as I said before, it keeps people in this state of economic anxiety. Nobody wants to lose their health care. Everybody needs food. They have to pay the rent. And if wages are kept low, and prices are kept high for things like education and healthcare and everything else, who has time to hit the streets and resist the military empire that is really spending all of the nation's wealth? And when I say the nation's wealth, that's our taxes. That belongs to us. And yet, where is it going? It's going to weapons makers, it's going to big corporations, and it's going to the very wealthy who are able to influence and write the tax codes. So that's a real problem. I think that you resist it by doing sort of this moral inventory of yourself first to see where it is you land and find out exactly what you're being called to do, because everybody's ministry is going to be a little different. Not everybody is going to spend 11 years in prison. That is a particular kind of witness. but your witness and your ministry may be in another area. It may be just as profound and just as important. So I think one of the things to do is to do that moral inventory, see where you stand, see what you have to offer, and then always, as Phil said, you must be part of a community, because to go it alone is just too hard. You know, it's the odds are too great and you're going to lose your conviction and your faith. But when working in community, not only are you going to be supporting each other, but you're going to be benefiting from everybody else's ideas. And that's how, when I was mentioning this idea of creating the blood on the draft files, that came about through community. And the first thing Phil wanted to do when he got out of prison in 1973 was start a community. It was never Liz and I are just going to go off and live by ourselves. He knew that it was essential, if he was going to continue resistance, you have to be in community. So it looks like all of you are part of a community in Worcester, which is great. And I think that's a very important thing to do.
I think, Scott, you had a question? You're unmuted, Scott. Can you unmute yourself?
All right. Sorry. First, I want to thank you. It is an enormous pleasure for someone like me, and many of the people here, I'm sure is true, who knew Phil, to see someone who did not know him and to digging into his work and reflecting on him. It's very inspiring. It's wonderful. And I just have two short comments, and not really a question. One is that when I first got to know him, he seemed like a swashbuckling World War II character. And we asked him to write an article for our Catholic Worker newspaper once, and he wrote a short article, and the title says everything. It was entitled, "Choke Back the Excuses." And this was what, Phil was just full. And one evening at Jonah House, some new volunteer sat next to him, and just after the grace, he turns to the volunteer, he says, "You're not another goddamn vegetarian, are you?" He was really out of that other generation. But when I had the grace to spend 3 days in jail with him for a demonstration at the South African embassy, wow, I was amazed at his patience, his kindness, and his good humor. He just laughed uproariously at some of the funny things that Dan Quayle had said. And I just thought, he felt when he was in jail, he was free to, quote unquote, let his hair down. And I was just amazed, and it was really quite precious. And I look forward to digging into your book, because from your comments tonight, it shows that you understood this marvelous complexity and holiness of this really great man from a great family. And some of us have the good fortune of working with his daughter on an anti-nuclear demonstration for April Fool's Day. So it goes, the work of that family goes on, and it's not over.
It's one of the great benefits of doing this book is meeting people who knew Phil and just giving me these little insights about his personality, or I was arrested with Phil, or I lived at Jonah House with Phil for a while. And all of it helps fill out the picture in my mind of Phil's personality and the kind of man that he was. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And I've just met so many people along the way on the book tour and things like that who've given me little pieces of just gold that help with that.
Mm-hmm.
Pat, you had a question.
Really, it's a commentary, and I'm so grateful to meet you, Brad. I received the books for the Pax Christi Assembly that's coming up, and the progeny in terms of Philip Berrigan will be with us as Pax Christi Assembly on November 2nd. And so if anyone's interested here, you can go to paxchristimassachusetts.org and register. It should be a wonderful, wonderful event. I guess I'm just so struck by the prophetic voice and the beautiful articulation of deep thoughts that you want to own for yourself. And the humility that comes with knowing you don't don't register in that category yet, but you're willing to keep at it. And I've got the book with me, and I too want to dig into it. So it's just a pleasure, and it's so good to be with so many good people as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. That's
Thanks,
great.
Matt.
And Frida, real quick, Frida wrote the preface to the book, I have to say, and it is beautiful. And it's a great reflection about her dad, and it's just really beautiful. And for that by itself, it's worth buying the book.
Mike, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, Claire. I also just wanted to mention that I put the link in the chat just now, which will bring you to a flyer with registration information for the Pax Christi Assembly that Pat just mentioned. And Brad, thank you for all the insights that you've expressed, which certainly square with my impression of Phil. I only met him once, and I think that was actually well before no, I guess he was sort of in the middle of a prison kind of throughout his life, off and on. But this was in the late 1970s when I was teaching a course that I had created at a community college. I know that's part of your background too, in Connecticut, which I called the Nonviolent Alternative. And that was basically, pretty much as the title implies, looking at the history of nonviolence, and in particular in the United States. And I learned that Phil was on a speaking tour nearby. And so I was able actually not to get him to come to my classroom in Enfield, but to be able to bring my class to a talk that he was giving at a nearby state university. And so we all had great fun, kind of mingling with Phil afterwards. And he was, as Scott said, very down to earth and good humored. And again, this was, of course, long after Catonsville and, his notoriety from that period. But he was very patient with students with, virtually no knowledge. They were beginning to know a little bit more because this was partway into the course. We had studied Gandhi and Martin Luther King. But, his form of protest was still very new to them, to most of them. So my question for you is going back to what you referred to as the tender side of Phil. Did you find much writing by Phil about his family, about his kids in particular? You mentioned Liz and the beautiful passage that you read, but I'm wondering if he ever wrote much about his kids.
He did, and that was reflected in his journals. And so he has children, I guess, late in life for Phil. And so as we get into the mid-70s, you start to see Frida and Jerry coming up, and then 1980, when Kate's born, coming up, being reflected in his journals. And there were some very moving passages about his hopes for them. And it's not be just like your mother and I, but it's, to find their own way in this very difficult world. And, there are some heartbreaking passages, particularly towards the end in his journal, when he's talking about the kids and the family receiving the news of his cancer, and how they were taking that as a family. So there are some really moving sections in there about the family that, again, it's easy to characterize Phil as this larger than life kind of guy, but I wanted to make him fully human the way he was trying to become. And that meant showing the family side, the tender side, also showing the side where he admits to being overbearing and domineering and makes mistakes. He admits to having the blahs in prison and being filled with depression. These are all important things, I think, for us to recognize, because if we go in with the idea that you have to be this sort of Superman of nonviolent resistance, I mean, who can do that? It's important to recognize that Phil was like the rest of us in many regards, you know, both with his disappointments, but also with his love of family and love of Liz and love of life. And that was probably one of the most important things that I came away with, was that he really did believe that, you know, we were all one family here, and he was willing to lose his life, his liberation for that. That the brother and sisterhood was really important, and he remarked on that again and again. The first writing that I put in the book is Phil leading a youth retreat, and it's called Father Higgins Youth Retreat. So if you can imagine Phil Berrigan in 1958 leading a youth retreat, that's kind of a scary thought. You know, it'd be really intimidating as a kid to have Phil leading your retreat. But he finishes his little talk with them by asking them this question. He says, "Are you going to recognize God's goodness in your behalf and submit to his desires for your salvation? Or are you going to go through life playing both ends against the middle, playing cozy, not committing yourself, sitting on the fence? These are the questions you should be asking yourself today." And then he finishes with, "What's it going to be with you?" And when I read that, I thought, 1958, Phil's probably asking himself that same question. What's it going to be with him? Right? Because he doesn't yet know, is he going to be a parish priest, or, you know, he's just starting to get involved in civil rights and things like that. And so I love that question, what's it going to be with you? Because I believe that wasn't Phil asking the question. That was God asking Phil the question, and Phil repeating that question to everybody else. Because I do believe that that's the question Phil heard from God again and again. What's it going to be with you? Are you going to sit on the fence playing both ends against the middle? Or are you going to take a stand? So, yeah. Interesting for one of the earliest writings. I thought it was very insightful into his personality.
Yeah, so Brayton, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Brayton. Or am I seeing that you have your hand up, I think?
But you go, do you have something to say, Claire?
I can wait. You go ahead.
I just want to say that.
No, I don't have anything.
Suzanne and I met Phil in 1978 at a retreat in Rowe that he and Liz were conducting, Rowe Camp in Rowe, Mass, November 1978. And we both got there late. They got there late as presenters, and we got there late. And they had a dinner, and we sat together. So here it is, Phil and Liz for dinner. I never met them because I knew all about them from the old days, but never met them. So I think from the beginning, I felt, and I think Suzanne more so maybe, even felt that this was like family. And then Phil would come to Boston and do programs. He first came to us for about 5 days, and we hung out. And the thing that my favorite thing about Phil was being with Phil, was talking to Phil. He was like an uncle. And there was an ease right away. It was just beautiful. It was a beautiful thing. And the Gandhi said, this is what I think he offers the world.
And Phil always said Gandhi.
Gandhi. Yeah, Gandhi, one of his teachers. He had some gripes about Gandhi, but he was really followed.
And Gandhi, he's just
kind of a down-home way of saying it. Yeah. So Gandhi said, the nonviolent disciple has to non-cooperate with evil with total disregard to consequence. This was Gandhi's view, that we know about love, we know about the virtues, but are we going to sacrifice for them? Are we going to risk everything? So the issue for Gandhi was courage. And I agree with him. I think that is true. And Phil became a disciple of that, or Phil fulfilled that teaching, non-cooperation with evil with total disregard to consequence. It was Dan that told us, Phil just didn't possess the normal fears of humans. And I think, Phil's answer to that was that he acted in spite of his fears, and I think that's true. And I think he didn't really possess the normal fears of humans, but he acted in spite of his fear. But that's his legacy, is courage. Courage. And courage is what's needed. And he lived it. And 11 years in jail. Gandhi was 11 years in jail, so they mirrored image that sacrifice as well. But he is a beautiful. I thought he was a beautiful man to be with.
And I have heard that from so many different people, that same reflection in terms of how approachable he was and accessible and funny he was, but yet also how courageous he was. Phil remarked that the military and the seminary were good preparation for prison. So, you know, he kind of had a head start on some of us going into prison.
I interviewed him a couple of times. I ended up writing, I think, his obituary for NCR, but that's not why I was interviewing him. I just was interviewing him for something. And I remember him telling me this story. I don't know if you came across it in his journals, that as you noted, he was in World War II, and his job was he was like a marksman. He would make sure that the missiles were hitting. And when he told me that, I had this vision of Bill like making sure that the projectiles were exploding and destroying. And it was like let me clear my head, because I had known what Phil was about as a peacemaker. So after he told me this, we got a little bit more into the interview, and he said, yeah, when they dropped the bomb, I was at Woodstock with Dan, and we all marched around, the Jesuits with the American flag, cheering, because the A-bomb had been dropped. And again, a shaking kind of my head. And I said, so when did you shift? What provoked your shift? And it was the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was down in New Orleans hearing, this is as he told me, confessions. And because Americans really thought they were all going to be blown up. And people were standing around the block for confession. They were so frightened. And that infuriated him, that two men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, could make a call that would affect humanity. And he said, I was so angry at that kind of power and hubris. So I always remember that, and know how he was a red-blooded American in his youth. That's my reflection. But my question, my mind shifts to Phil in September of 2002. And so now he's been out of prison. He dies in December of that year. And I think we were at the ALC in Philadelphia, and he was pretty weak. And the US had started bombing, the coalition bombing on Afghanistan started in October. And I was struck by his wanting to know what I thought. I was like, you're asking me, you are such a, you've been the person I've looked to for interpreting the times. But I wondered, in your writing, were there journal entries about Bill talking to God of doubt or his own, where has this led? Because we the country keeps making war and keeps making war and keeps making war. So that's one question. My other question is, what did he write on his deathbed? Or
Yeah.
what were those last, was it kind of, God, nothing's changed? And, I'm just curious because the young Phil, the old Phil,
What a beautiful reflection and memory that you have of both the interview and then seeing him so late in his life in those last days. The what he wrote on his deathbed, part of what he wrote was that I die believing that nuclear weapons are the scourge of the earth and an offense against God. So that was one of the more powerful quotes in his last writing. I did not come across anything that smacked of Phil thinking, what's it all been for? We're in a worse place than we've ever been, or anything like that. There were journal entries where he would express disappointment in himself or in others in the movement, but never in what the movement was trying to do or in the hopes for peace and the belief that nonviolent resistance was humanity's only hope. He would always say, don't get tired, can't afford to get tired, don't quit. And that was a remarkable thing with it, was that I didn't come across, I mean, this guy was from the 1950s till 2000 fighting this Lamb's War. And not once did I come across a journal entry that expressed any kind of doubt about the worth of what he was doing or the importance of it and what everybody else was doing. He believed that this was the right path and that it would eventually succeed. And there was never a reflection that said, gee, it's not been worth it or anything like that. So it was very optimistic. It was a lot of times filled with some anger at the government, anger at the people aren't doing more, anger at people in the movement and things of that nature. But yeah, not a disappointment in the belief that nonviolent resistance was humanity's best hope, was humanity's only hope. And you were talking earlier about his role in World War II, and he writes a lot about that, and what he saw and going through these great European cities that were completely destroyed and reduced to rubble, and bulldozers were just bulldozing all the dead bodies and putting them in piles. And he was seeing all of this horrendous stuff. And as you said, when the bomb was dropped, he was very happy about that. He bought into the propaganda that this meant Americans didn't have to go into Japan and fight there. And I think probably his best writing comes in response to that and why he changed and how he shifted. And a lot of times when I was working on this book and talking to editors, they would say, Dan was the writer, Phil was the organizer, Phil really wasn't a good writer. And I would say, I totally disagree. I think Phil's a great writer. He's different than Dan, but he's a great writer. And here's an example of his really great writing where he's reflecting on his service in World War II and how he had clung to this patriotic belief of the soldier. He wrote, "For many years, I clung to my own set of lies, hiding within the shell of collective agreement. In time, that shell began to crack. Light streamed in, forcing me to re-examine killing, making me take a hard, non-rhetorical look at war. I saw a boy standing on the field of battle, bristling with weapons, preparing to shed his blood and spill the blood of his enemies for his king, his emperor, his state, some grand, everlasting ideal. An ancient figure stooped with the knowledge that the killing had gone on for centuries and could well continue until the end of time. The boy took off his helmet, and I could see the pain in his eyes, see that he wanted to lay down his sword and shield, but that he feared the consequences. It was one thing to die on the field of battle, quite another to be banished to the realm of cowards. I reached out to him, and I found myself. We walked together, this ancient young warrior and I, knowing that the road we were taking would be lonely, even more dangerous than the battlefield had been. No one would recognize us when we returned home. There would be no welcome for traitors who break their swords into pieces, leaving their armor and their weapons down by the riverside." Now that's really powerful, beautiful writing that gives me goosebumps every time I read it. And I think that's an example of his writing, but that image of the boy, the eternal soldier, it makes me think of me, it makes me think of my son, it makes me think of all the sons through all the eons that have been sent off to these needless, absurd wars and have had to die for that.
Thank you. We are past the 8 o'clock hour. Paul Gingras, you have a question, and yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for writing this book. I'll be brief here. I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I'm doing a documentary on Tom Lewis. We recently went up to Bath Iron Works and did some filming for The Golden Rule. Phil Berrigan and Tom Lewis and others did an action up there in the Sullivans. And we interviewed a gentleman, his name was Larry Gilbert. He was responsible for the prisoners, which was filming that stuff in the federal government there. He was a Vietnam veteran, a former Lewiston police chief, but he was in charge of the prisoners, which was Phil Berrigan. He had an epiphany. He said, here this guy was 72 years old. And he said to him, what am I doing out there? And he told me he was marching with us up at the Bath Iron Works. So he met Phil and said he was a Catholic himself, who was a Vietnam veteran. And he totally had a total transformation. Has to meet Phil Berrigan in prison, in the jail up there. So I left my contact information in the chat. I'd like to speak with you at some point in time.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. And Claire, I don't know if you're able to put my email address in the chat for everybody. Anybody who wants to contact me, feel free to do it. Paul, the gentleman you're talking about, that was the warden up there at Bath. I was in a Zoom with him about 2 years ago on a totally, not a Phil Berrigan issue. We were talking about the war in Ukraine. And he started telling me that story about watching the prisoners up there and Phil being one of the prisoners. And one of the guards said, what do you think about that Catholic priest in there being in prison? And he said, I think that's a Christian in there.
Right. You're exactly right. He gave us an extensive interview. I'm in contact with them to this day. We went up there with, we had the Golden Rule going past the Bath Iron Works boat down there. We spent 3 or 4 days up there. I met so we have a lot of stuff that I'd love to talk to you. I never met Phil, but I do have a lot of content on Tom Lewis. Did you run across him?
Yeah. I didn't get to talk to him, but obviously he came up in all of the ratings and everything like that.
Right. He started out in the civil rights movement, then he met Phil, and I have the original 16mm film.
Wow.
The Catonsville 9.
Oh, okay. Of them outside saying the Lord's Prayer.
It's the original film.
Yeah. I would love to see.
There's only 2 of them.
Yeah.
And they threw that thing in a dumpster. They were going to charge the Baltimore television station with conspiracy to the FBI.
Wow.
I'm working with the Worcester Historical Museum right now, and I'm archiving a lot of the stuff that I've got a lot of material on Tom Lewis.
I was up at Cornell University last week speaking, and that's where the Berrigan papers are housed. And the librarian where we were speaking in Annabelle Teller Hall says, hey, I have something to show you that I found in a cardboard box in a closet here. And he pulled out what I guess is 8mm film. It's in the round tin can, the big film spools, and he says, this is old Phil and Dan Berrigan stuff from the 60s. And he says, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I found this in the back. And I said, that needs to be archived. You got to get that right over to the archivists and have them take a look at that to be able to save that and preserve it for future research, because that kind of thing and what you have is so valuable.
Yeah, I know. This film is in excellent condition.
Yeah.
And I've already had it put into 422 res. I was either going to give it to Holy Cross or give it to Marquette, but I've got so much. But people are calling me up that have artwork of Tom Lewis's and artifacts. I spent like 3 years with him, documenting, photographing him, and he was, you know, there's an incredible story there, you know, and there's a lot of research and a lot of stuff what you've done. So I'd love to talk to you and, you know,
Yes.
possibly, you know, collaborate with you in some of this.
Great. That would be wonderful. Yeah. Claire, please share my email address.
Yes, I just put
everybody.
it in the
Okay.
chat, so I hope everybody can see it. bradwolf1310@gmail.com.
That's it.
And I am mindful of the time. Brad, thank you so much. A second announcement about the walking tours happening Saturday, October 19th at 10, and also join us if you're in Worcester, October 22 in front of City Hall, 5:30. Let's rally for a ceasefire resolution and ask our council members to recognize the Palestinian people. So that is 2 events coming up in the next few days. But what a rich evening. What a tender evening, Brad. Thank you so much. Thank you. And
Thank
you're
you.
getting lots of applause.
Thank you so much. It was great talking with all of you, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate the invitation. Good luck with the ceasefire resolution. We did that here in Lancaster successfully, so good
That's
luck with
great.
that. Yeah, good luck with
So
that.
we'll hold you up as an example.
Lancaster, Pennsylvania passed it.
Yes, there you go. But
Yeah.
before we close, why don't you tell everybody how they can buy your book?
So you can go, of course, Amazon's got it, Barnes and Noble's got it, bookshop.org has got it. You can go to Fordham University and get it. Here, I'll hold it up. Such a great picture. Fordham University Press did a wonderful job with the book and putting it together. So any of those places you can buy the book. And I think it's something, as I was saying to Claire earlier, you can leave it on your bedside and just read sections of it because it's broken up into sort of 2 or 3 page excerpts that are very digestible. It's like Dorothy Day's diaries, you know, you just keep it by your bedside and read them as you will. So I hope you all enjoy it, and I hope you're inspired by it and have as much from it as I got from it.
Mike, please.
Just a last point on Brad's book. As Pat mentioned, she'll have copies for sale at the Pax Christi Assembly on November 2nd. That's where I plan to get it.
There
So
you
thank
go.
you, Pat, for holding one for me.
Yes, there you go. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for
Brad.
Thank you, Brad.
You're welcome.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye. Thanks,
Have a great evening.
Claire.
Everyone.
Goodbye, everybody. Bye,
Take care.
Pat. Bye,
Bye-bye.
bye,
Bye-bye.
Paul. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.